I'd spent months asking them nicely. Months of polite conversations. Months of watching them drive across my property without permission. Months of watching them destroy my fence in the process. Every time they hit it with their truck, it cost me hundreds of dollars to repair. Every time I repaired it, they'd smash through it again. And every time I confronted them about it, they'd just laugh. They had a shortcut. My property was the shortcut. Instead of driving 5 extra miles around the long way, they could cut straight across my land and save time. That convenience was worth more to them than respecting my property rights. Worth more than paying for the damage they were causing. Worth more than basic neighborly decency. I called the police. They said it was a civil matter. I sent a cease and desist letter. They ignored it. I posted no trespassing signs. They tore them down. I consulted with a lawyer who confirmed I had every right to keep them off my property. But knowing I had the right and actually stopping them were two different things. So I decided to stop asking nicely. I decided to make my property something they couldn't use anymore. Not by tearing anything down. Not by doing anything illegal. But by making their shortcut physically impossible. By putting something on my property that would block their path permanently. And when I did it, everything changed. Let me tell you about the property first. Because understanding the layout is important to understanding why this shortcut existed and why people were so determined to use it. I owned about 12 acres of land in a semi-rural area. The property sat between 2 roads. On one side was a main road. On the other side was a back road that connected to a small industrial area where several businesses operated. My property essentially formed a natural bridge between these 2 roads. The direct route between the main road and the back road, without crossing my property, required driving about 5 miles out of the way. 5 miles doesn't sound like much. But for trucks making multiple deliveries or workers commuting to the industrial area every day, those 5 miles added up. Added fuel costs. Added time. Added inconvenience. At some point, someone figured out that they could cut through my property to save those 5 miles. Maybe it started with one person. Maybe they found a gap in my original fence. Maybe they just drove across an open section of my land and established a path. However it started, it became a route. A worn dirt track across my property that people started using like it was a public road. I bought the property 3 years before the trouble started. I'd purchased it as an investment and as a place to eventually build. The land was partially cleared and partially wooded. It had good bones. It had potential. I'd put up fencing along the boundaries to define the property clearly. Good quality fencing that cost me a significant amount of money. Not decorative fencing. Practical, sturdy fencing meant to mark my land and keep people off it. The fence on the side facing the main road was the critical piece. It was the barrier between my land and the road. Without that fence being intact, there was nothing to stop vehicles from simply turning off the main road and driving straight across my property to the back road on the other side. In the beginning, the fence worked. People respected it. Or at least they couldn't easily get through it. My property was quiet. No trespassers. No problems. Just 12 acres of land sitting peacefully while I made plans for what to build there. Then a construction company started working on a project near the industrial area. They had heavy trucks. Multiple trucks making multiple trips every day. And somebody on that crew discovered the shortcut. They figured out that if they pushed through my fence, they could save themselves 5 miles per trip. With multiple trucks making multiple trips per day, that was significant time and fuel savings for them. The first time they broke through, I assumed it was an accident. Maybe a truck had gone slightly off the road. Maybe the driver hadn't seen the fence clearly. I repaired the fence and moved on. But then it happened again. Same spot. Same section of fence. Pushed down or smashed through by a heavy vehicle. That's when I realized this wasn't accidental. This was intentional. Someone was deliberately breaking through my fence to create and maintain their shortcut. They weren't even trying to hide it. The tire tracks were clear. The path across my property was worn and obvious. They were using my land like it was their private road. I went to the construction site and spoke with the site manager. I explained that my fence kept getting damaged. I explained that trucks appeared to be cutting through my property. I asked them to stop. He was polite enough in that moment. He said he'd look into it. He said he'd speak with his drivers. But the next morning, the fence was broken again. The construction company's promises meant nothing. The site manager had said he'd address it. He hadn't. The trucks kept coming. The fence kept getting damaged. And my patience kept shrinking. I went back to the construction site for a second conversation. This time the site manager was less apologetic. He said he couldn't control every driver. He said the road conditions were difficult. He implied that maybe my fence wasn't positioned correctly. He was making excuses instead of taking responsibility. The conversation ended without any commitment to change the behavior. I started documenting everything. I bought a trail camera and positioned it to capture the section of fence being damaged. Within 2 days I had clear footage of a large construction truck deliberately driving through my fence. Not accidentally clipping it. Deliberately driving through it. The driver didn't even slow down. He just pushed through the fence like it wasn't there. I took that footage back to the construction site. I showed it to the site manager. I showed him exactly which truck it was. I showed him the driver's face. I explained that this was deliberate property damage. I explained that I expected them to repair my fence and compensate me for the previous damage. I expected that video evidence would force accountability. The site manager watched the footage. Then he shrugged. He said trucks sometimes needed to maneuver in tight spaces. He said if my fence was in the way of their operations, maybe I should consider moving it. He actually said that. Move your fence because our trucks need to drive through your property. The arrogance was breathtaking. I told him clearly that I would be filing a police report. I told him that I would be pursuing legal action for the property damage. I told him that this was going to become expensive for his company if they didn't stop. He didn't seem particularly concerned. He probably dealt with complaints regularly. He probably had lawyers who handled these things. He probably thought I was just another property owner who would eventually give up and accept the situation. The police report was filed. An officer came out and saw the damage. He saw the tire tracks. He saw the path worn across my property. He acknowledged that what was happening was illegal. But he also explained that without catching the truck in the act at the moment of damage, there wasn't much they could do immediately. They could note the report. They could make contact with the construction company. But enforcement was difficult. I hired a property lawyer. I sent a formal cease and desist letter to the construction company. The letter was detailed. It documented every incident. It cited specific laws about trespassing and property damage. It demanded compensation for repairs already made and threatened significant legal action if the trespassing continued. The construction company's lawyer responded. Their response was dismissive. They claimed their drivers were using a route that had historically been used by others. They claimed there was some kind of implied easement. They claimed that without a clear recorded restriction, their access was permissible. Their legal argument was weak, but it was an argument. And it would take time and money to fight it in court. Meanwhile, the trucks kept coming. The fence kept getting damaged. The repair bills kept mounting. Each section of fence cost several $100s to properly repair. It had been damaged 6 times by this point. The total repair cost was approaching $3,000. And the construction project showed no signs of ending soon. I posted no trespassing signs. They disappeared within days. Removed or ignored. It didn't matter which. They weren't there anymore. Normal methods were failing completely. I took a step back and thought about the situation carefully. I'd tried being polite. I'd tried direct confrontation. I'd tried video evidence. I'd tried police reports. I'd tried legal letters. I'd tried no trespassing signs. None of it had worked. The construction company had calculated that the cost of ignoring me was lower than the cost of changing their route. They decided that my protests were an inconvenience they could tolerate. So I needed to change that calculation. I needed to make ignoring me more expensive than solving the problem properly. And I needed to do it in a way that was completely legal. In a way that they couldn't argue with. In a way that would work regardless of what excuses they made or what their lawyers claimed. I started by analyzing the shortcut itself. I walked the entire path they were using across my property. I measured it. I mapped it. I identified exactly where vehicles entered my land and exactly where they exited. I looked at the geography carefully. I studied the terrain. I was trying to understand where the choke points were. Where the critical points in their route existed. Where blocking the path would be most effective and most permanent. The entry point from the main road was the key location. It was a relatively narrow gap between a tree line on one side and an existing structure on the other. The trucks had to pass through this gap to access my property from the main road. If I could block that gap effectively, the shortcut became completely unusable. There was no alternative entry point from the main road side. The geography didn't allow it. I researched what I could legally place on my own property. The answer was essentially anything that didn't create a safety hazard or violate local ordinances. Large rocks. Concrete barriers. Heavy posts. Earthen berms. These were all legitimate options for a property owner to use on their own land. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need to notify the construction company. I didn't need to wait for legal proceedings to conclude. I decided on a combination approach. Large boulders placed at strategic points. Not just one or two rocks that a determined truck driver might try to push aside. But multiple massive boulders arranged in a pattern that would make passage impossible for any vehicle. Boulders weighing several tons each. The kind of rocks that can only be moved with specialized heavy equipment. I contacted a landscape company that specialized in natural stone features. I explained what I needed. Large decorative boulders. Multiple pieces. Placed strategically along my property boundary. The landscape company understood immediately. They'd done similar things for other property owners dealing with unauthorized access. They knew exactly what kind of rocks would be needed and exactly how to place them for maximum effectiveness. The cost was significant. Several $1,000s for the boulders and installation. That was real money. But I calculated it against the ongoing cost of fence repairs. Against the legal fees I was accumulating. Against the stress and frustration of dealing with this problem indefinitely. The boulders were a one-time expense. A permanent solution. The math made sense. I also decided to build a new reinforced fence section behind the boulders. A fence that was significantly stronger than what had been there before. Steel posts set in concrete. Heavy gauge wire. The kind of fence that would require serious equipment to damage. Not the kind of fence a truck could push through casually. I scheduled the boulder installation for a Saturday when I knew the construction site would be quiet. I wanted the work done completely before the trucks came back on Monday morning. Saturday morning arrived and the landscape company showed up early. They came with a flatbed truck carrying the boulders and a large crane attachment to place them precisely. These weren't decorative garden stones. These were massive pieces of natural granite. The smallest one weighed close to 3 tons. The largest was over 5 tons. Moving them required equipment and expertise. The placement took most of the day. The landscape company operator was methodical and precise. He positioned each boulder carefully. Not randomly scattered but strategically arranged. They were placed close enough together that no vehicle could pass between them. They were positioned far enough onto my property that no one could argue they were encroaching on the road or right-of-way. Every boulder was completely on my land. Completely legal. Completely within my rights as a property owner. I also had them position the boulders in a slight curve rather than a straight line. This was deliberate. A curved arrangement was actually harder to circumvent than a straight line. It eliminated any angle from which a truck could approach and push through. The curve created a wall effect that was more effective than simple linear placement. While the boulders were being positioned, I had the fence crew working simultaneously on the reinforced fence section behind them. Steel posts were drilled into the ground and filled with concrete. Heavy gauge fencing was attached with industrial fasteners. This fence wasn't going to be pushed through by any truck. It was built to withstand significant force. The combination of boulders in front and reinforced fencing behind created a barrier system that was genuinely impenetrable for vehicles. I stood back when it was finished and looked at what had been created. It was actually quite attractive. The natural granite boulders had a certain aesthetic quality. They looked like they belonged there. Like a natural feature of the landscape rather than an emergency barrier. But their purpose was unmistakable. Nothing was getting through that section of my property boundary. Sunday passed quietly. The construction site was closed. Nobody came through. I spent the day making sure everything was secure and properly positioned. I walked the barrier line multiple times. I looked for any gap I might have missed. Any weakness that a creative truck driver might exploit. I found none. The barrier was comprehensive and complete. Monday morning came. I was up early. I positioned myself where I could observe the entry point without being conspicuous. I wanted to see the moment of discovery. I wanted to witness what happened when the first truck arrived, expecting to take the familiar shortcut across my property. The truck arrived at approximately 7:15 in the morning. A large construction vehicle. The same kind that had been destroying my fence repeatedly. It turned off the main road and approached my property boundary the way it always had. The driver probably wasn't even thinking about it. This was routine. He'd done this dozens of times. He expected to drive straight through. Then he saw the boulders. He slowed. He stopped. He sat in the truck for a moment. I could imagine his confusion. Then his frustration. Then his realization that this route was no longer available. He got out of the truck and walked up to the boulders. He looked at them. He pushed against one with his hands. Nothing moved. He walked along the line of boulders looking for a gap. There wasn't one. He went back to his truck. He sat there for several more minutes. Probably calling someone. Probably reporting that the shortcut was blocked. Probably expressing some frustration about what had happened to his convenient morning route. Then he put the truck in reverse, turned around, and drove the long way. The reaction from the construction company came quickly. By Monday afternoon, I received a phone call from the site manager. He was angry. He said I'd blocked a route that their trucks needed to use. He said I was interfering with their operations. He said I needed to remove the boulders immediately. He spoke like someone who was used to getting his way. Like someone who expected his complaints to be taken seriously. I listened to everything he said. Then I responded calmly. I told him that the boulders were on my private property. I told him I had every legal right to place them there. I told him that his trucks had been trespassing on my land for months. I told him they damaged my fence multiple times. I told him that my patience had run out and the shortcut was permanently closed. He threatened legal action. He said his company's lawyers would look into whether I had the right to block access that had been used for an extended period. He was reaching for the implied easement argument again. The same weak argument their lawyers had made in the cease and desist response. He thought the threat of legal action would scare me into removing the boulders. I told him to have his lawyers contact my lawyer. Then I ended the call. The construction company did send their lawyers a letter. The letter argued that the historical use of the route created an implied easement. It demanded removal of the boulders. It threatened court action if I didn't comply within 30 days. My lawyer responded comprehensively. He explained that implied easements require specific legal conditions that weren't present. He explained that the use had been unauthorized trespassing, not permissive use that could create easement rights. He explained that no court would force a property owner to remove legally placed structures from their own land based on a trespassing company's claimed easement. The construction company's lawyers didn't respond further. They'd apparently done their own analysis and reached the same conclusion my lawyer had. Their legal argument wasn't strong enough to pursue. Forcing a property owner to remove structures from their own land was not something any reasonable court would order under these circumstances. Other trucks tried the route over the following days. Each one encountered the boulders and had to turn around. Some drivers got out and examined the barrier more carefully than the first one had. Some tried to find alternative paths around the boulders on my property. But the placement had been too thorough. There was no way around them without going onto clearly impassable terrain. Within a week, the trucks had stopped trying. They'd all adjusted their routes. They were all going the long way now. 5 extra miles per trip. Multiple trips per day. It added time and fuel costs to their operations. That was the consequence of their months of trespassing and fence destruction. That was the price they paid for refusing to respect my property rights when I'd asked them politely. My fence stayed intact. Not a single section of fence was damaged after the boulders went in. Because trucks weren't coming through anymore. Because the shortcut was gone. Because the convenience that had made my property worth trespassing on had been eliminated. I walked my fence line every few days expecting to find damage. I never did. The quiet was remarkable after months of constant problems. The trail cameras I'd installed to document the fence damage now recorded nothing. No trucks. No trespassers. No damage. Just my property sitting quietly and peacefully the way it had before any of this started. About 2 weeks after the boulders went in, I received a visit from the county sheriff's department. An officer showed up at my property to investigate a complaint. Someone had reported that I'd created an obstruction that was blocking access to a public route. I immediately understood that the construction company had tried a different approach. They'd filed an official complaint with the county. The officer was professional and courteous. He asked to see the boulders. I walked him over to them. He examined the placement carefully. He looked at how they sat on my property. He pulled out a property map on his tablet and confirmed the boundary lines. He verified that the boulders were completely on my land, not encroaching on the road or any right-of-way. Then he asked about the complaint. I explained the entire situation. The months of fence damage. The repeated trespassing. The construction trucks using my property without permission. The repair costs I'd incurred. The failed attempts to resolve it through normal channels. I showed him my documentation. The photos of fence damage. The trail camera footage of trucks driving through. The police reports I'd filed. The cease and desist letter I'd sent. The officer reviewed everything carefully. Then he asked if the boulders were creating any safety hazard for the public road. I explained that they were positioned well onto my property, not near the road edge. He could see that for himself. They weren't blocking traffic. They weren't creating visibility issues. They were just making it impossible to enter my property from that location. The officer made notes on his report. Then he said something that made me smile. He said that as far as he could see, I'd placed decorative landscaping features on my own property. That I had every right to do that. That there was no violation of any county ordinance. That the complaint would be closed as unfounded. He suggested I keep my documentation organized in case the complainant tried to pursue this through other channels. But from a county enforcement perspective, there was nothing wrong with what I'd done. After he left, I realized the construction company had run out of options. They tried legal threats. They tried official complaints. Nothing was working because my actions were completely legal and completely within my rights. The boulders were staying. The shortcut was gone permanently. I heard from my lawyer that the construction company's lawyers had made one final attempt. They'd proposed that I remove the boulders in exchange for a payment that would cover my past fence repairs and some additional compensation. Essentially, they were offering to buy access across my property. My lawyer presented the offer to me and asked what I wanted to do. I declined. The amount they offered wouldn't have been unreasonable in a normal easement negotiation. But this wasn't a normal negotiation. This was a company that had spent months damaging my property, ignoring my requests, dismissing my concerns, and threatening me with lawyers. They'd had the opportunity to negotiate respectfully from the beginning. They'd chosen arrogance instead. Now that they realized they had no leverage, they wanted to negotiate. But I was done negotiating. The boulders stayed exactly where they were. My property stayed exactly as I'd arranged it. And the construction trucks kept going the long way. Every single day. 5 extra miles per trip. Multiple trucks. Multiple trips. The inconvenience was now theirs, not mine. That felt like exactly the right outcome. The construction project eventually wrapped up. The heavy truck traffic that had been using the shortcut disappeared completely. The company finished whatever they'd been building in the industrial area and their equipment moved to different projects. The immediate problem that had driven the conflict was gone. But the boulders remained. I kept them in place because the problem hadn't been just that one construction company. The problem was that my property sat in a location that would always be convenient as a shortcut. If I removed the barrier, someone else would eventually discover the route and start using it the same way. The boulders weren't just a response to one company's trespassing. They were a permanent solution to the geographic reality of my property's location. Interestingly, some neighbors reached out to me after the boulders went in. People who lived nearby. People who'd apparently dealt with similar issues. They said they'd watched trucks cutting through my land and had wondered when I'd finally do something about it. Some admitted they'd considered doing something similar on their own properties but hadn't wanted the confrontation. They appreciated that I'd taken a stand. A few people from the industrial area complained. Workers who'd become accustomed to the shortcut. People who now had to spend extra time driving around. They saw it as an inconvenience I'd created unnecessarily. They didn't see it from my perspective. They didn't calculate the fence repairs I'd paid for. They didn't consider that I'd asked repeatedly for the trespassing to stop before taking action. They just saw their convenience disappearing. I didn't care about their complaints. My property wasn't a public service. It wasn't a community shortcut. It was my land. I'd purchased it. I paid taxes on it. I had rights to control access to it. And I'd exercised those rights after exhausting every reasonable alternative. The fence I'd installed behind the boulders stayed in perfect condition. No damage. No wear. It stood as a clear secondary barrier that reinforced the message the boulders sent. This property was protected. This boundary was enforced. Access was not available. I eventually got around to building on the property. I had a small workshop constructed in one section. I cleared and improved other areas for future use. The property became more valuable to me as I developed it according to my plans rather than having it serve as an unauthorized through route for commercial vehicles. The legal bills from the entire conflict had been significant. Between my lawyer's time responding to the construction company's threats and the cost of the boulders and reinforced fencing, I'd spent close to $8,000 total. That was real money. But I calculated it against the alternative. If I'd done nothing, the fence damage would have continued indefinitely. Repairs would have mounted. The stress would have continued. And I would have established a precedent that my property boundaries didn't matter. $8,000 to permanently solve the problem and establish clear boundaries was worth it. The peace of mind was worth it. The satisfaction of successfully defending my property rights was worth it. And the knowledge that no one would try this again because the barrier was permanent and immovable was worth it. The property sat quietly now. No trespassers. No damage. No conflict. Just land that I owned and controlled. The boulders had become a familiar part of the landscape. Visitors sometimes commented on them as attractive natural features. Nobody who didn't know the history would guess they'd been placed strategically to block unauthorized vehicle access. But I knew. And that knowledge brought a certain satisfaction every time I saw them. So what should you take away from this experience? What are the lessons that apply beyond just my specific situation with one construction company and one shortcut? Because property boundary disputes are common. Trespassing is common. And feeling powerless to stop people from using your land without permission is frustratingly common. The first lesson is about knowing your property rights and understanding what you can legally do on your own land. I could place boulders on my property because it was my property. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need to notify the trespassers. I didn't need approval from the county. Property ownership comes with rights. One of those rights is controlling access. Another is placing structures or landscaping features on your land. Understanding these rights gave me options that I might not have considered otherwise. The second lesson is about documentation. I documented every fence repair, every incident of damage, every conversation with the construction company, every police report filed. That documentation became crucial when the county investigated the complaint against me. It became crucial when lawyers got involved. It proved that I'd tried reasonable solutions first. It proved the pattern of trespassing and damage. Documentation turns your word against theirs into documented facts that can't be disputed. The third lesson is about exhausting normal channels first. I tried polite conversation. I tried police reports. I tried legal letters. I tried posted signs. I didn't go straight to the nuclear option of permanent barriers. This mattered legally and ethically. When I finally installed the boulders, no one could argue that I'd been unreasonable. I'd tried everything else first. The barrier was a last resort after normal methods failed. That sequence of escalation protected me from accusations of overreaction. The fourth lesson is about strategic thinking. I didn't just randomly throw up barriers. I analyzed the shortcut route. I identified the critical choke point. I planned the placement carefully to maximize effectiveness. I used the geography to my advantage. Strategic thinking made the solution more effective than a hasty emotional response would have been. The fifth lesson is about permanence. Temporary solutions to trespassing often fail because determined trespassers will wait them out or circumvent them. The boulders were permanent. Multi-ton rocks can't be moved without specialized equipment. They weren't going anywhere. That permanence sent a clear message and created a genuine barrier that couldn't be easily overcome. The sixth lesson is about accepting that some people will be upset with you for enforcing your rights. The workers who'd used the shortcut were inconvenienced. Some neighbors thought I was being difficult. The construction company was frustrated. But their convenience or opinion didn't override my property rights. You can't make everyone happy when you're defending your boundaries. And that's okay. Your property rights matter more than other people's convenience. The seventh lesson is about calculating costs realistically. The boulders were expensive. But ongoing fence repairs were also expensive. Legal battles are expensive. The stress of unresolved conflict has costs even if they're not purely financial. When I calculated the total cost of the barrier against the alternatives, it made sense. Don't just look at the upfront cost of solving a problem. Look at the total cost of not solving it. The eighth lesson is about the satisfaction of standing up for yourself. After months of being ignored and dismissed, after having my property damaged repeatedly, after being threatened by lawyers, I took action that worked. The problem stopped completely. That outcome wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about refusing to be a victim of someone else's entitlement and disrespect. Now I want to hear from you. Have you dealt with trespassers using your property without permission? Have you had neighbors or businesses that refuse to respect your boundaries? Have you found creative solutions to property disputes? Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every comment and I'm genuinely interested in how others have handled similar situations. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. It helps more people find content about property rights and standing up to bullies. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about defending your property, dealing with difficult neighbors, and creative problem solving when normal methods fail. And remember this: your property is yours. You have rights to control it. You have rights to exclude trespassers. You have rights to place barriers and structures on your own land. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone convince you that their convenience matters more than your ownership. Know your rights. Document everything. Try reasonable solutions first. But when reasonable fails, don't be afraid to take strategic action that solves the problem permanently. Those boulders sit on my property to this day. They're not going anywhere. The shortcut is gone forever. And my fence hasn't been damaged once since they were installed. That's what success looks like. That's what happens when you stop asking permission to protect what's already yours and start exercising the rights you've always had.